is just to discuss about a campaign that Aphrodite has been running together with other partners. It's called the Stop the Bleeding campaign, and in the current dispensation, it's referred to the Africa Debt campaign. So just to contextualize what the campaign, we normally refer to STB, which is an acronym for Stop the Bleeding. So Stop the Bleeding is basically stop the bleeding of illicit financial flows or flows out of the continent. And this, just to give a context on how illicit financial flows became to be a focus of interest, at least within the continent. In 2011, there was African Conference of Ministers that established a high-level panel of experts. This comprised of former presidents of multi-development banks. Those are former president of South Africa, actually, the second president, Thabo Mbeki, just to establish a high-level panel to understand why, at that point, this was towards the 2015, the halfway mark of the Millennium Development Goals. Africa was still not at where it was supposed to be, and the panel was just established to understand what was the cause of this. And in that 2011 meeting that established the panel, 2011 to 2012 to 2015, they did the research that accumulated to what is now referred as the Thabo Mbeki panel report, or a high-level panel report on illicit financial flows. And the results of that panel report was just the reason we were not achieving MDGs at that time was because we were losing, or we were net creditors to the world, meaning that we were losing, at that point, the estimation was $50 billion per year of resources or revenue that we will receive. And this is through illicit means. From the report, what they described illicit means are through corruption, what Honorable Shabalala was referring to tax evasion, tax avoidance, proceeds from crime. So that was what they felt like was the main cause of what not having to achieve the Millennium Development Goals at that time. And for that, it meant that we are not getting the enough domestic resource mobilization or resources to invest in development of our economies as a continent. So from that, civil society, Pan-African civil societies took up this call from the high-level panel report to really go deeper to find how then can we stop the bleeding or outflows of these resources. And just to define what illicit financial flows, according to the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa, is money that is illicitly earned, transferred, or utilized, and hence, through corruption or through tax evasion, tax avoidance sort of processes. So, from that, the civil society need to support this call to stop the bleeding. Then this campaign was formalized in 2015. And this was a consortium of 7 organizations, Aphrodite being one of them. I'll just skip to the slide just to show you which members of the consortium are. Apart from Aphrodite, we have the African Women's Development Communication Network, also known as FEMNET. We have the International Trade Union Confederation of Africa, ITUC Africa, Pan-African Lawyers Union, also known as PALU, Tax Justice Network Africa, and these were really the pioneers of the campaign. We have the NAWI AfriFrame Microeconomics Collective organization, and then also Trust Africa. So these 7 organizations form the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, and basically what they do is continue the struggle or continue the call from the high-level panel report to stop the bleeding or resource from the continent. So why the Africa Debt Campaign? So when you look at the nature of illicit financial flows, you can make an intersectionality of debt and illicit financial flows. When you're the country or the continent now, and with the recent estimates, we are losing about, if you look at 2024 statistics, we are losing 1.3 trillion per year in resources or revenue that we could be using to develop our economies. Also, the current statistics in debt servicing, or the total debt of our continent, stands at $650 billion. That means we are losing more illicit financial flows than we are losing or you're using towards debt or debt servicing. So with that picture in mind, it means this is actually the biggest problem. But how do you link it to the debt issue? When a country is not able to, domestically raise enough revenues, it leads to borrowing. And this is what Jason was doing his presentation about yesterday, to just understand how we get into that debt cycle or debt trap. So illicit financial flows in their nature, where they are supporting the net outflows of domestic resources that we can use, it means countries are turning to more borrowing to spend towards social sector spending and to economic development aspirations. And therefore, it means that we're always in that cycle of prioritizing debt compared to sort of handling or trying to stop the bleeding or stop the flows of these resources from the continent, which should be actually the focus. And just to make the connection of the debt and IFFs as well, is that as you continue to borrow, it means unequal distribution continues, inequality continues. It means that with the stories that we're trying to connect how it affects the ordinary people, it means that it continues to widen the levels of inequality within our continent. It also means that in still making the connection between debt and illicit financial flows, it really undermines the channels of which governments reduces its spending to social sectors. And of course, like I said, it leads to higher borrowing. And now that in the current, the statistics that also Jason provided yesterday, the interest rates are continuing to increase, meaning debt servicing is becoming more expensive as we continue. So just to give a context of why now, in the current dispensation, what the STB is doing is being called the African Debt Campaign, is because of those interlinkages between debt and illicit financial flows. So what the campaign really does is it's basically a broad movement of citizens comprised of civil society, trade unions, women rights activists, youth activists. And the call for action here is citizen involvement, right? With the overarching objective to win the hearts and minds of the population. And I think we've covered this quite a bit in the last, yesterday and today. How do you make people more aware or concerned about the issue of debt and the issue of illicit financial flows? How do you make them or capacitate them to be more, be able to speak against those sort of, we speak about the systems that perpetuate illicit financial flows, that perpetuate us into that cycle of constant borrowing. How do we get people to care and start advocating for better systems? So it's about winning back the conversation on the social contract. How do you make government, for example, illicit financial flows are more prominent in the extractive sectors, right? It's where we're losing a lot of money. Why? For one, it's the kind of contracts that we have. I think Dr. Leila, I don't know if she's in the room, can speak about this. The contracts that we have there within the mining sector, extractive sector, really do not speak to the social contract. Governments do not enter these contracts with the benefit of people in mind, right? If they did, we wouldn't have the issues of illicit financial flows. But it's also making the connection or democratizing the debt crisis. And what we also refer as democratizing the debt discourse. And this really means making the connection of debt and tax, debt and gender, debt and climate finance, and how all those things affect the people. And it's also about humanizing the debt crisis. And I think we also touched on this in the different interactions that we have. And all this is to connect to the real day-to-day struggles of the African citizens. So yeah, I've just touched on why now the African Debt Campaign as part of the Stop the Bleeding campaign. And it's just basically to bring that awareness of the intersectionality of debt and illicit financial flows, and how we can now start putting the necessary reforms, the necessary structures to stop these outflows, and now focus on making African countries not get stuck in that loop of constant borrowing. And this is also to support the growth of our domestic resources to grow our economies. So how does the campaign work? So there are 3 pillars in how the campaign functions. Like I mentioned, one function is citizen action. The other function is to make a structural shift in the narrative of illicit financial flows and the debt discourse as part of democratizing it. So as part of political mobilization, the campaign supports political mobilization to prevent African countries from unsustainable debt burdens and IFFs. And this is through equalizing the power balance between debtor governments and creditors. And I think Jason's presentation yesterday touched on this in the sense that the reason why we have IFFs and debt, it's because of the financial, what you call the global financial architecture as it is designed in a way that constantly keeps us in this process of unequal power balance, right? Where, for example, the players, you touched on the players, we have the credit rating agencies which unfairly rate countries where we have to borrow more expensively. We have debt restructuring systems that do not or are not fit for purpose. And therefore, it means the political mobilization is to speak against these structures in a way that leads to equalization of power between debtor governments and creditors, and leads to a fair and transparent process where African governments are what we call, and we like to call and say, we are rule makers and not rule takers. So that is one of the pillars of the campaign. The other one is on, and so yeah, so this is just on touching on the structural shift. One is the political aspect of it. The other one is the economic narrative. How do you change the economic narrative through the campaign? And this is just to really challenge the orthodoxy of the neoliberal economic development agenda. And again, this has been discussed at length on how the neoliberal policies that we have continued to engage with have been putting us in that system of constant borrowing, where we are not, for example, exporting at a high level sort of goods, but we are more of importers of low-level consumer goods. So that means we are not able to even generate enough revenue for our economic development dispensation. The other pillar is on social. which the campaign really is very high or very keen on, is to speak on this renewal of the social contract between state and citizen. And I think part of it was what the exercise we did yesterday with the legal contracts. What contracts are governments getting into? How are they helping the citizen for, going towards economic development? How do you keep the government accountable through the necessary channels? And of course, is the government putting in necessary transparency and accountability systems so that this social contract can be maintained? So the African campaign really focuses on those three pillars to undertake its process. And within that, the focus is also on ideation, providing intellectual alternative. What we've presented to here, like the Maputo Manifesto, is one of these alternative intellectual presentations where we provide an alternative view of how us as rule makers can make the system work for us, or what should we be doing to make the system more, work for us rather than against us, right? Or actually challenge the existing structures. And like indicated there, it's a challenge to the neoliberal convention. If you look at the Maputo Manifesto, and Honorable Shabalala talked about it, is, things like the patriarchal system. How do you view that in the sense of the way it continues to put us in that process of not providing economic development for our countries? So ideation, intellectual alternative is what the campaign also does, and it's meaning the minds in the intellect of the population. The other aspect of it is providing negotiation strategies. So when you have these engagements with journalists, is to, when you go to, and in the presentation that was given here, how you go to get stories, how do you provide alternative direction? How do you provide alternative ideas to citizens so that they are able to challenge some of these power imbalances? So here we are doing, through the negotiation strategies, we are providing that through you and from you to your other engagements, providing that a different narrative, and how to capacitate citizen-state engagement, developing country to developed country scenarios. How do you understand debtor-creditor relationships, and advise or, hold the government accountable to say that this is not what we should be doing, but providing these alternatives. And it's also talking about an Africa global architecture. I think you've seen recently, as part of this, is the African Union providing leadership in what an African global architecture is. One of them is through what they're now calling the African credit rating agencies. We're supposed to be a challenge of the existing credit rating agencies that we heard about, the Moody's, the Fitch, and how they are. This is supposed to provide an alternative to how we are rated and how we access development financing. So just to summarize, what the campaign is to mobilize, organize, and reawaken advocacy on debt, and to influence policymakers at country, regional levels on prudent debt management, which I've just touched on. So how do you make the political engagement? So our guiding sort of light, I would say, is the African Union, and this is the Africa Agenda 2063, which it's the roadmap to Africa's development, right? So the campaign supports Agenda 2063 in achieving and dismantling, and actually African Union has its own separate process against the illicit financial flows and combating illicit financial flows. So we support the African Union's agenda, and it's a mandate in advancing a better outcome of the African states and African citizens, and especially for marginalized women, marginal groups, including women, youth, and children. Part of it is also the campaign is civic mobilization. Like I mentioned, democratizing the debt cost. So this is through education, intellectualizing, I've touched on that, participation in campaigns, in engagements at the local level. It's giving a human face to the debt issue. If you look through our website, we have done different I'd say videos or movies just to make that connection of humanizing the public debt issues, especially in the context of how it affects youth and gender. So I'd encourage, for example, to watch a movie called The Debt Palaver we did last year for Nigeria. It's a very touching movie. I think it just demonstrates how you can humanize the issue of debt. And it's also linking the wider economic system, that is the taxation system. How do you link the issues of taxation? How do you link the issues of social service provision, where the government is spending more on debt servicing compared to service social service spending? How does it speak on the political system? We've talked about debt and elections here. Is the way your country, I'd even say how your democratic system, what you call a democratic system for your country, does it serve to the purposes of a better debt discourse? We've talked about how elections are conducted. If it's leading to more debt, we need to be questioning, is that the better way of what we call a democratic political system? The political system is also touching on transparency, accountability, and governance, elected officials on how they go about public financial management, public debt management, debt contracts, negotiations, and implementation. So just to give a context also, or what we've been doing as part of civic mobilization, we do have every year this national meeting or national debt advocacy meetings. We do them in collaboration with our partners in the different countries. And from that, we've been launching the Stop the Bleeding campaign. And in the current dispensation is what we're calling the African Debt Campaign. As you can see there in the two pictures on my far right, we did it in Uganda, and we had actually participants signing on into the campaign, and the promises that the campaign needs to do and what their functions are as part of the civic mobilization agenda. So we did that also in Zambia, the middle picture, Tanzania, Cameroon. We've done it in also in, I think we did it in Malawi as well, and Benin. The pictures are not here, but so this is what we've been currently doing as part of the campaign and getting the civic mobilization agenda of the campaign moving. The other pillar of the campaign is legal advocacy. And what Dr. Leila was trying to address or provide context for in her session, and which is part of the campaign as well, is to reform and redress the power imbalances in the debtor-creditor citizen ecosystem. And this can be done through a disruption of the litigation process that goes into enforcing or creating policy and institutional reforms. And what are the pathways to this? One of them is to strengthen the voice of the public through public interest litigation. I think Tax Justice Network have done this in what they did with Mauritius DTA, where they took the government to stop a DTA contract that they wanted to engage in that would have led to a poor, or rather a more, less, it would not have benefited the country basically. And then part of it is to also strengthen the legal and policy framework for debt contraction. And this is what we were doing in the exercises. How do you, if the debt contract is not speaking to the social contract, does it mean that the legal and policy frameworks are not there to support that? So how do you strengthen that? And this can be done through, if it's not there, there's the process of a fair, transparent arbitration mechanism. But that is another conversation altogether. But it's part of what the campaign also tries to highlight. And in addition to also highlighting the weaknesses in the existing debt contract, which we saw from the exercises we did. So how does the media, or how can the media engage in the Stop the Bleeding campaign? Excuse me. So through the different pillars that I've highlighted, if you look at political engagement, this can be done at the national level. And for us, as the African Debt Campaign, I failed to mention that, is that AfroDad is leading the African Debt Campaign as part of the consortium members. And how we are doing this to enforce the political engagement at the national level, we have the 3 guiding documents that provide a political economy narrative of what to consider as a better public debt management, how to reform the financial systems that is well-based or well fit for us. And one of this is the African Borrowing Charter. The African Borrowing Charter is basically guiding principles on better debt management, better debt borrowing for African governments. The Maputo Manifesto that you have seen today, and I hope you get to interact with it. The Harare Declaration was one of the, I think, the biggest sort of documents that we use to really define as an alternative ideation of what a financial system that is fit for African countries, because it provides a political economy, a description of the challenges of the current global financial architecture and how that can be reformed in a way that is fit for us. Then at the regional and continental level, we do that through the high-level panel recommendations. So if you go through the panel report that I referred to, it has provided a series of recommendations, and mostly also on the extractive sectors, because that is one of the highest lead or sources of illicit financial flows. So we do try to support those recommendations of the high-level panel. TGNA, which is one of the consortium members, have developed what is called the IFS tracker, which is basically tries to see or to show in the different countries how they are trying to putting mechanisms to prevent illicit financial flows. And of course, the African Union, as I mentioned, has its own mandate of in preventing or trying to put mitigation against illicit financial flows. Civic mobilization, as I mentioned, it's just how do we engage the public in putting a face into the debt issue, but also on the issues of illicit financial flows. Legal advocacy. So we do this in 2 levels. And I think my colleague touched on this, the UN Tax Convention, which is just an alternative tax rules that is being designed currently being discussed at the UN that provides really the avenue on how we are going to prevent this challenge of illicit financial flows. And like it was mentioned, this is something that at the national level also we need to have to keep an eye as journalists to make sure that this process is not stopped, it's not undermined in whatever way possible. I think we've already started to see that kind of intention with just recently the United States stepping out out of the negotiations that were happening for the terms of reference. The other option that we have as part of legal advocacy, the campaign that is also focusing on is the process of UN Financing for Development. The fourth Financing for Development conference is coming up in June. And as part of the campaign, we are proposing an alternative in the how sovereign debt workout mechanism is going to be undertaken. So these are as part of how the media or as journalists you could engage engage the campaign is through those different levels. And I think in the different sessions that we've had, this has been highlighted, and your role basically in providing the stories, where you need to critique, where you need to raise more engagement with citizens. This has already been demonstrated. So that all feels so what I've just explained is basically this: how do you report on the SDB African campaign? So the opportunities actually with the elections. We know, like, for example, Burundi has elections this year. Bringing this campaign into the face of the elections and bringing people to speak on how, for example, elections lead to more debt for the government, because, you know, we've seen, like someone mentioned, for somehow during elections, money is found to conduct elections, but not towards social sector spending. It could also be at the regional and continental level. We've heard about the reparative theme. The campaign here to support this theme is to call for one, debt cancellation. It could also be asking for repatriations, meaning that where we know, for example, in the case of illicit financial flows, money, we know, for example, in Congo, money is leaving the country to go, for example, in the United States, and we know the mining companies that are responsible for that, holding them accountable, calling them out, being part of that process that enables illicit financial flows, and calling for repatriations, which is also part of African Union's theme, is something the campaign can also support, and journalists can also follow in speaking about. We spoke about the South African presidency. Our presentation was done today, and that is basically on the reform of the global financial architecture, providing intellectual ideation on what an alternative architecture looks like. And I've also spoke on the financing for development. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Stop the Bleeding campaign is all about. Thank you so much for your attention. Any questions? No questions? Oh, wow. Okay, so I guess, but we welcome, okay.
Ok, merci. C'est Félicien Ouessou du Bénin. J'ai suivi votre présentation avec plaisir. Et j'ai remarqué que vous avez énuméré une panoplie d'actions, de démarches en vue de mettre un thème ou bien de réduire cette crise de la dette. Mais je voudrais savoir, est-ce que la responsabilité publique est vraiment engagée? C'est-à-dire, est-ce que nos gouvernants, les dirigeants, adhèrent à la cause? Une deuxième question qui reste quand même liée. Après toute cette lutte, est-ce qu'aujourd'hui vous avez des acquis? Merci.
Thank you. Um, can you share with us what are some of the challenges you faced in engaging governments, like political engagement? And how far do you intend going to other countries?
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Okay. So how do you success, right? How do you get leaders, and if they've been any positive results in the engagement? Well, I'd say, of course, with political engagement, it's a work in progress, right? For example, we have elections coming up. Elections, it's a cycle after every 5 years, right? So we have parliamentary engagement, and we do this through the African Borrowing Charter, just to highlight the different principles of public debt management, public financial management, the role of parliament in debt contraction, and the role of finance ministers in negotiating some of these contracts. But because of that, the cycle, the change of leaders, sometimes it becomes very hard to track progress because of that constant change. However, we try and support, for example, in just minimal, minimal activities, or minimal providing knowledge is one of the things that we feel like continues to open those conversations and that can lead to positive results. We have what we do currently with the SADC PFM model law, which just basically provides an alternative on public financial management. And we've seen within the SADC region, countries like Zambia and Zimbabwe taking some of those provisions that we are advocating for to refine their public financial management laws. So I'd say it's work in progress. We have seen some positive results. It is not a 1 year, 2 year thing. It's a continuous process. But as long as we're engaging and providing that alternative views, alternative dispensation on public debt management, we have seen right now governments, and then we've seen even with the example with Kenya last year, with how the members of parliament were engaging people on issues of the budget. There's an awareness of their role within debt management, for example, budgeting in social sector spending, and where revenue should be channeled and such and what have you. So I think we have seen some positive results. It's incremental, but I'd say it's not all is lost. And I think again also with the political engagement, of course in other countries, civil society is not very welcome. Going to see a foreign minister or a member of parliament, it's not a very welcome gesture from civil society. But where the civil space is open to conversations, I think we have seen positive engagements. For example, recently we had a workshop in Zambia with members of parliament. They're thinking of proposing a bill that will take on the public financial law to change that in a way that makes the debt management and the role of parliament more visible in that case. So I think it depends. Where the civil space or the civic space is open, then we're able to have positive engagements. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. We'll go to the next session, and Howard, welcome.